Well, hello and welcome to the Impress webinar. I'm David Leigh and this is my colleague Kurt Barling, and we're going to talk about diversity and racism in the media. I'd like to start off by asking you, Carl, what it is that you mean by diversity.
Well, for me, diversity is a very polite word for difference. We've tried to find a word which is least offensive to people, and diversity is the one we've come up with. But actually, it somehow masks those things which make us very different. So, if you're from the Caribbean, or from Africa, or you're a woman, or you're a lesbian, or you've got some other kind of different quality about you, that all makes you a different have a different outlook, if you like, in life. And diversity masks that. So I would say it's a polite word for difference, and it's trying to negotiate those differences in life between those different types of people that journalists have to do in their everyday lives. Unfortunately, David, we haven't done it, and we're coming to this conversation because it has not been done, and it's still not being done adequately within our newsrooms.
Okay, so you're saying there's a diversity problem in newsrooms?
And negotiating the difference problem in newsrooms, absolutely. So not just in newsrooms, but in how we shape what we think people want to know about. And let's take, for example, myself. I was born in 1961. Virtually for the my entire childhood, there were no black people in the newspapers. My grandfather worked for the Daily Mail. He was in the print room at the Daily Mail. He used to bring the Daily Mail home every morning. By the way, he also brought the Morning Star and the Tribune home every morning, so I would get a sense of the spread, the diversity of the news agenda from left to right. Not many brown people in there, though. And that gave me a sense that actually there was something missing. I didn't quite know what it was when I was growing up. But then I got to 1985. I was just starting my PhD at the LSE, and I stumbled into the Broadwater Farm riots. It was carnage. It was like Armageddon. And I went home and watched the news. I then read the news in the following weeks, and I was frankly disgusted by the tone that had been taken by people who said they liked to know about the world. Well, the world that they wanted to know about and let other people know about was not the kind of world that I myself understood. And I said to myself, okay, if you can do something useful with all that learning, by then I was PhD, you've got to become a journalist and try and seek out those alternative narratives so that people can see a reflection of themselves in the most basic means of communication, newspaper, television, radio. That for me was my mission, if you like, over a 30-year career as a journalist.
But are you saying it's just a question of there aren't enough brown people in newsrooms, or is it that there aren't enough women, there aren't enough working class people, there aren't enough of all kinds of people? What is it that you're really saying?
I'm saying there are not enough enlightened people. And the way in which you bring enlightenment, you shed light on the different spaces in our community is by having those different people you just described in a newsroom. You do have to have women in the newsroom. You do have to have people of colour in the newsroom. You have to have that mix so that those people can go out into the community that they serve and reflect that community. Of course, if you're a journalist, you still want a top line. You still want to have a good tale, but you need different people to interpret that world in order that the journalism is negotiating those differences, is diverse in the modern word.
You see, listening to you, I was thinking a lot of people criticise what the newsrooms have written because they say they're full of basically Oxbridge white men. Mm-hmm. And I thought, well, I'm an Oxbridge white man, actually, talking to you.
Don't be embarrassed about it.
I'm not embarrassed, and I'll tell you why. Because when I thought about why I'm an Oxbridge white man, I thought, well, actually, it's not as simple as you might think. Why did I go to Oxbridge? I tell you, because I grew up in a council house, and because I had the local authority paid my fees at a school, which then got me into Oxbridge, who took me in on a sort of diversity program, really, and that was the sort of golden key that got me into journalism. So it's true, you need that sort of background to get easy entry. But it doesn't necessarily follow that you're a kind of posh boy, because that's what happens.
But you were a bit of an outsider, David. Even in your time, even though you went to Oxbridge, when you got to Fleet Street, you would have still felt a bit of an outsider because you had those working class instincts, you had those working class outlook. You'd seen the world in a different way. And you, perhaps in your journalism, wanted to become an investigator to put the world to rights because of that, not because you had a sense of privilege. You know, modern Britain is fundamentally a society built on a racist premise. That is, we had an empire. Well, excuse me, an empire was built on a racist premise. We're better than you. We need to govern you. We need to organise your lives because you are not capable. That was the doctrine. Now, to imagine that Britain decolonised in the 50s and 60s, obviously starting with India in 47, and that somehow all of that preceding history of nearly 500 years suddenly was washed away, phooey. You know, the attitudes and the outlook which dominated the ruling class, if you like, the elite in Britain, was infused in our journalism, infused in the way in which our journalism worked. What was our journalism there for? Well, actually, the journalism was there to make money, let's be honest. You know, proprietors own newspapers to make money. They got the advertising in and they added some journalism
Well, up to a point.
too.
Some of them own newspapers in order to make propaganda.
As propaganda too. The Morning Star is a classic example of that. You know, Tribune is another classic example of that. And the Daily Mail is probably, some would argue, an example of that. The point is, it is a particular view that it was purveying. It wasn't there to protect democracy, so to speak. They weren't there to do that. They were there to make money. But the point is by doing that, they were driven by the thought that they needed to serve a particular audience rather than serve democracy. And in that, they select people for their newsroom.
Yes.
In their own image.
So are you saying that the British media are, to borrow the phrase, institutionally racist?
Completely. You know, when I worked at the BBC and during Macpherson, during the whole story around the murder of Stephen Lawrence, I listened in newsroom. I was nearly always the only person of colour in the newsroom. And I listened to people endlessly going on about how racist the police were, how institutionally the racist the police were. And I'd look around the newsroom and I'm saying, you know what, you should do a bit more self-reflection on yourselves, because actually, how can the police be expected to serve the community without improving its cross-section of the population? And you here sitting in the newsroom criticising them are not thinking about the same things as you're criticising the police for. Actually, the media has woken up to that. There are lots more discussions about it. Just recently, the BBC, for example, brought out a new plan on how to deal with its lack of diversity at senior levels in the organisation. So they have woken up. But don't forget, Macpherson was in 1999. So that's 19 years it's taken to catch up. So yes, the media space, the structures of the media space are institutionally racist. And we need to recognise that and deal with that. The culture is essentially racist. It needs deconstructing. There's a caveat there, of course. The caveat is there's suddenly a whole new space which is not owned or governed or ruled or directed by proprietors. We're calling it the digital space, if you like. There are spaces where people can go and engage in journalism without the barrier of a proprietor, without the barrier of a big institution like the BBC or ITV. That space is being colonised by a whole range of people. Whether they'll make money out of it, David, is the big question, of course. Can they make a living out of it? Big question, but it is a space which is not colonised by the traditional elites. That means it'll take a different shape, a different course. The differences will be negotiated in a different way in that space.
Well, it occurs to me, listening to you, there are two different things going on. I mean, one is, are there enough people of colour in newsrooms to make a difference to the way they look at the world? And secondly, is the kind of content, the kind of material that's put out by the media, can we reform it? If you're saying, in effect, that it has an inevitably racist tinge, if I'm putting words into your mouth, tell me. So is there a role, say, for regulators like Impress to improve the way the media actually write about these issues?
You know, journalism is a bit like a big family, isn't it? You need to have people in your family who pick you up now and again. and saying, well, you can't behave like that. That's not the way to behave in public. And actually, journalism needs to recognise that. The way they've been behaving in public has not been the right way to behave in a society which is way more diverse than it was even when I was a child. And it's becoming more diverse because it's more conscious of its diversity and how actually those differences are valuable. They're valuable to help us understand who we are. It's valuable to help us operate in the world beyond Great Britain. You know, it's important that we understand the value of that. How can you understand the value of that if the people who are purveying the message are the same old people? You can't. Therefore, yes, you do need more people of colour in the newsroom. You do need more women. Actually, you have got a lot more women now in newsrooms than there were 30 years ago, and women in senior positions, and women who are leader writers and commentators. So that's a good thing. You need more diversity of roles, more diversity in management, for example. There's no point in having management saying, oh, I think I'll take a black person because it makes me look good and I can tick a box. You want that person because they bring something distinctive to your newsroom, to your news coverage, to your content curation.
Yes, but what I'm saying is it enough just to have more people of colour or more women or more working class people? Isn't it also important to try and restrain people from what you might call hate speech?
Well, absolutely, yes. I mean, that's here when you're talking about hate speech, you're not talking about the mainstream, you're talking about essentially people at the margins. If we're talking about people within the mainstream of media
well,
production.
I don't know, I'm talking about people in the mainstream perhaps. I mean, some people would say, for example, a series of Daily Mail front pages attacking immigrants or saying that they're scroungers and so on has a racist tinge that veers towards hate speech.
Look, you know, in the end, there is a very important debate to be had about migration. Very important debate. The problem is that since 1968, really, that's when it really started, since Enoch Powell's speech, immigration and race are put together. You know, there are more immigrants coming from Europe and North America and Australia and New Zealand than there are coming from other parts of the planet, okay? So the framing of the debate is wrong, and more diversity in the newsroom will help call that out. It's important that we do have a national debate about migration, and as we might call it, immigration, because like all countries in the world that have wealth, accumulated wealth, people want to go there. And there has to be a way of regulating that. The idea that you have a picture of a black person and a story about immigration, that's wrong. And we need to call that out. That is what diversity in newsrooms can help you do. Change the tone. It's the tone, David, that makes the music. And the Daily Mail can carry on with its headlines on immigration as long as it gets the tone which reflects the community we actually live in, rather than the tone of the community that they perhaps think we ought to be living in, which is about 35, 40 years ago. That's gone. It's gone. Sorry, Daily Mail, it's gone. Therefore, you need to understand that in the terms of the way in which you curate your content.
So are you saying that if a newspaper like the Daily Mail had more diverse newsroom, they'd have more diverse attitudes?
I think particularly if you get further up the chain you get, the hierarchy you get, the more diversity you've got going up the chain, the more likely it is to have a more open and reflective tone in its coverage. Of course, if you go and work for the Daily Mail, you probably have a certain outlook and you probably want to write certain types of journalism. But frankly, if you look at The Guardian, half the time you read The Guardian, you think, oh, that's so Guardian. It's so predictable. I don't want predictability. People don't necessarily want predictability. I know the whole argument about silos and the rest of it, but people don't necessarily want predictability from their newspaper. The Guardian takes a particular tone on issues of ethnicity and race. Sometimes they get it wrong. They get it badly wrong. And they have a more diverse newsroom. So I'm sure within their newsroom, the Hugh Muirs and the Joe Harkers, are calling it out. You know, within the newsroom.
And the Gary Young.
And the Gary Young.
I mean, I was going to say,
even between them.
My experience at The Guardian was that they have got a pretty diverse newsroom. They've actually made a positive effort to diversify the
Yeah, but don't think that all those black people there, I'm not saying you do, but don't think all those black folk working at The Guardian all think the same. They don't. And the important thing is that they call each other out.
Well, it's diverse, not just because it's got black reporters, but also it's got a majority of women. How many lesbians it's got, I don't know, but I mean, they're a very inclusive.
But all those women
newsroom.
don't think the same, and all
course
those black
not.
people don't think the same. Hopefully all those white Oxbridge folks don't all think the same because of that input from other people. That diversity creates a different tonality in the journalism, whether it's a journalism which directs itself to a particular part of the political spectrum or another part of the political spectrum.
Okay, so is the way forward then positive discrimination, that you've got to make a positive effort to hire more people of colour, bluntly?
Well, that sounds a bit, like you've got to make a positive effort. Yeah, of course you've got to make a positive effort. Every editor who recruits new journalists should be making a positive effort to get the right people. They just have to recognise that the right people aren't necessarily the people who look like them. They may be people who don't look like them and bring something very positive to the newsroom, a different perspective to the newsroom, which their newsroom should value. So it's not about saying, oh, we need 10 black people in this newsroom. Actually, you might get 20 because they're the right people for the job. Actually, the way it goes, you might not get as many as you'd like, and therefore you've got to put more effort into the people you do get to make sure that their skill set they're upskilled. But the reality is I see students all the time, as you do. The range of students is quite incredible. We need to encourage more people of colour to come into the profession. That's the reality at the moment, is that they really don't trust this profession. They think, it's not for me. It's stuff full of white people, or it's stuff full of white Oxbridge people. There's going to be no space for me. To be a journalist, it takes a certain type of character. You have to be confident, you have to be brash, you have to be resilient, all really tough qualities if you're coming from a very poor, underprivileged background where you're getting knock the whole time. Now, you were able to extricate yourself through education from that space. We need to encourage more young people from diverse backgrounds to extricate themselves from that space in order that they can think of themselves as journalists, purveyors of truth, challengers of the elite, challengers of corruption. If you want, we want bullshit detectors, and bullshit detectors come not just from the elite who purvey the bullshit, it's the ones who want to call them out.
Well, let me just tell you a story, not from my own experience, not about colour, but about gender. When I was running the comment pages on The Guardian, I thought I have to do my bit for diversity. And when I had to hire a sub-editor, among the applicants, there was a single mother with a young child. And I thought, I've got to give this woman a chance. I'll do my bit, because she'll be finding it very difficult to get back and people won't take her seriously. So I hired her, and she wasn't very good. And I reflected afterwards that I'd made a mistake because I'd made my criterion her background rather than her skills.
No criticism, David, but what did you do to make sure when you found out she wasn't as good as you thought she was to improve what she did? Did you give her the support? Because still, her instinct, her value to the news space was still there. It's just that she couldn't engage effectively with the news space. So the point there is that, yes, sometimes you will get people who aren't quite up to scratch, but they bring something very special to your newsroom. They bring you access, they bring you an understanding. And yes, they might not quite have the tools to turn it into what you need at The Guardian or the Daily Mail, but then comes the responsibility to say, oh, we're not just going to get rid of these people because they don't quite come up to scratch. We're going to put in place the systems to ensure that they do come up to scratch. Of course, they still might not come up to scratch, and then you have to make a tough decision. But the reality is you can't just look at people and say, you don't just quite fit in with us and the way we do things. You've got to go that extra mile to make sure that this space, that is an important space, and Impress is all about having quality. Impress is all about saying people need to trust the information they get. Well, trust me, David, for the best part of 35 years, I've been dealing with people of colour outside in the vast British community who don't trust what the BBC do. They don't trust what The Guardian tells them. They don't trust what the Daily Mail tells them. They do it with a kind of, yeah, maybe, maybe not. And what we need to do is to ensure that people of colour, women, people of a different sexual persuasion can read and see and hear journalism which they believe reflects their lives and their concerns and their issues, and then they will trust us a bit more.
Well, I wonder whether the implication of what you're saying isn't, though, a form of positive discrimination, that it doesn't mean hiring the best person for the job.
There are an awful lot of people out in that space who have quality. As an editor, you've got to really be sharp about identifying that quality and identifying a quality which may need to be reshaped, might need to be moulded, but nevertheless understand that actually you're just not looking across the table at somebody and saying, yeah, I feel pretty comfortable with that person. Oh, I look down their CV, yeah, oh, they went to an Oxford College, that's great. Or, LSE, okay, not quite as good as an Oxford College, but I can kind of get them. No, they've got to stop doing that and look more broadly. Let's be honest, a lot of people came into journalism through local papers. They started at 16 or 17. None of them went to university. In the previous generation, they didn't even go to university. It didn't really matter whether they're Oxbridge or not. The difference is the Oxbridge ones were the gatekeepers. They decided what went in the newspaper. They made the decision about who they hired. But, the idea that you started off on the Rotherham Express and didn't aspire to become a Fleet Street journalist, many did. The point is that it's really important that you have an open mind. And I'm afraid lots of editors haven't had open minds. They need open minds about the kind of quality that they're bringing into their newsrooms in order that the content they purvey reflects the community that they serve, on whatever part of the spectrum they may lay as a purveyor of news.
But is it just editors who have the responsibility? I mean, I'm taking from what you're saying that people who might become journalists have also got a responsibility in a way to aspire themselves to do it, that,
of course.
That maybe there's a role for the education system here in encouraging people to aspire to these jobs, to go for it.
Yeah, I mean, look, when I became a journalist, it was, for me, being driven by the need to seek out those stories that weren't being sought out by other people, or seeking an angle on a story which others weren't seeking, in order to, tell the story, but give it a different flavour. I mean, I always remember a story I did on Remembrance Day, which is a big story, a big part of our national instinct about ourselves, talking about the war. Some people would say we talk about the war too much, but nevertheless, it's an important part of our national narrative. Of course, I was very conscious from a very young age that Caribbean and African soldiers played their part in that. So I always went out of my way when I did those stories to find those kind of examples to show people that actually it's familiar, but it's slightly different, and it makes people feel differently about the space they live in, the people they live alongside. Black people fought in the First and Second World War. It was an important part of my instinct to make sure that if I was doing a story like that, I'd reflect those histories. Of course, there were other times when, because of the journalist I was able to get access because people trusted me, not wholly. I mean, I had plenty of run-ins when I went into, difficult places, whether it be during riots or some other kind of issue, Mark Duggan getting shot, for example. There's still a lot of suspicion of you as a journalist, but there's also a level of trust that you've built up over time where people will give you the benefit of the doubt as a journalist. That's very important in newsrooms because you get access. You get access to a different take on the story.
Okay.
You don't come through the front door, you come through the back door. It's very important that newsrooms reflect that. So yes, you're right. Journalists have a responsibility too to be open-minded, to be driven by the facts, but facts which are in a world which is much more open rather than narrow.
I read a column the other day written it by a black journalist, an American, who was complaining about a piece in the New York Times. And this piece in the New York Times had interviewed some sort of American white supremacist in Ohio. He was basically a Nazi. And the complaint by the black journalist was that this had been a disgraceful piece of journalism which showed white misbehavior because he was giving a platform to a Nazi. And this saddened me a bit when I read it, because I thought what's happened here is that this has been seen through a racialized prism, because I know as a practicing journalist what this journalist in the New York Times was trying to do. He was trying to show people what this person was like in order to give you a window into what everybody would agree was a horrible person with a horrible ideology. But it had been taken by this black reader as Whitey giving a platform to Nazis. And what I'm driving at is, isn't it possible to be too racialized about the way everything is seen in journalism?
Yeah, of course it is. You know, in the end, I didn't read the piece, so I can't comment on its veracity or its tone. But if, you know, for argument's sake, if you're interviewing a supremacist, you can bet your bottom dollar that there are a whole bunch of people who support that view. And, you know, trying to understand in a complex world the way other people might feel about things is important. That's the role of journalism. Of course, you know, we can't be, as journalists, self-selecting on the kind of story sometimes that we want to do. We can't have a kind of use our instinct for propaganda. We have to use our instinct for openness, giving people a view of the world in as open a way as possible. I mean, if you go back to Popper, the open society, that's really what journalism should be part of. I mean, it's they're a bit Johnny-come-lately on it, but now proprietors are saying, yes, we're a really important part of democracy and keeping open societies. Well, if that's the case, then, you know, we need to, as readers, appreciate that that means that we're going to hear some unpleasant things when we pick up our newspaper too, or hear from some unpleasant people. That's all part and parcel of what we do. And there is a danger that we become too self-selective, that we try and keep things out of the agenda which we're uncomfortable with, or that we allow certain groups to dictate what we put in our newspaper because they're uncomfortable with it. I don't think that's right. I'm taking what you say from this black individual in America, although I have to say, David, I'm not a great fan of talking about black America and black Britain in the same breath, because they're two very different beasts. We can learn a lot from the black America, from Reconstruction onwards, through civil rights, through the challenges that they faced to try and become citizens. Britain, fortunately, never, when black people came here in great numbers post-war, never stopped them being citizens. They could vote. Okay, they faced an awful lot of discrimination. We know about the no blacks, no Irish, no dogs. Yes, that was a hostile environment they came into, but they were always citizens, and the efforts, the legislative efforts here were very much about trying to withdraw or take down the barriers of discrimination in the workplace, in housing, and so on and so forth. So we have a very different history. So we can't always use the American example to inform our own, I think. I mean, black journalism in America is a huge thing. All the way from Reconstruction in the 1870s onwards, been a huge way of black Americans trying to reshape the context of their lives within America. Britain hasn't had that experience. Britain has to approach the problem, if you like, in a different way. My book on racism was partly about saying to people, we need to reimagine the way in which we deal with this story, not just work through the myths of the language that's been bequeathed to us through, 500 years of colonization. We need to somehow pull ourselves out of that to reimagine this space we're in. It is important, I think you're right, that people, black or white, come to this space and understand they'll sometimes read things or hear things that are a little bit uncomfortable with. News organisations have to be mature enough to be able to respond to that criticism. It may be that the criticism's valid. The important thing is that 40 years ago, a black reader making that call would have just been biffed out of court. Now perhaps the newsroom will listen and say, yeah, maybe there is a way we can make that work better for our audience in the future.
Well, that's an interesting point, because in fact that episode sparked a debate within the New York Times, and they published some of the debate. So it started people thinking about the issue in a,
Isn't that what we do?
new way.
Isn't that what we do? We're
Yeah.
not just doing propaganda, getting people to soak up soma. We're trying to stimulate people to think about the world in which they live. And that's the point. The more diverse the newsroom, the more stimulation we're giving to people to think about the world in which they live, which is a complex place. It's not a simple place that we live in. It's not a simple place to report on. Therefore, that complexity, although we have to sometimes sub it down to 600 words, nevertheless needs to remind people that these are things we need to wrestle with.
Well, you're taking a relatively optimistic and positive view, I think, but what would you say are the big remaining problems for the media in the sense that, where are the areas where, racism is still a pernicious influence?
Well, if I look at my career, so I became a professor, just a few years ago, and my previous 30 years, more or less 30 years, at the very beginning of my career, I experienced a lot of what I would describe as overt racism within the business. That is people questioning my qualifications. That is people questioning my right to be there. That is people saying to me, well, of course you only got here because you're on a scheme of some sort, weren't you? No, I wasn't on a scheme, actually. I was a university lecturer at the London School of Economics. I had a PhD. I had a pretty first-class CV. I got here on merit. So I was having to defend myself from the moment I got into the organisation. That's overt racism. Now, that changed over time. People became more comfortable with you as an individual. They gave you more head of steam. You became more comfortable in the institution and in the space yourself, so you were able to push the boundaries. And if you look across the sort of 2,000 films or so I made for the BBC, you'll see a fair mix of stories that I did. Many of them, like I say, challenging the way in which we saw a traditional story. Racism is still, unfortunately, very alive. Race is a bit of an issue for me. The whole notion of race, there is one race, of course, it's called the human race. All those other racial categories which have emerged at a time when Britain had an empire, at a time when the white supremacists ruled. And the reality is that we're still locked into that language of black and white bequeathed to us by the false prophets of racism in the 1800s, and we're still battling to get ourselves out of that. Okay, put that to one side for a moment. That's a big challenge. We still have to wrestle with that philosophically. Racism in terms of people seeing you or seeing me and saying, not quite sure about that person because he doesn't quite look right. Oh, impressive CV, there's something that's a bit uncomfortable about him. Well, that kind of bullshit's got to go, because that's the kind of thing that's holding back newsrooms. That's the kind of thing that's holding back journalism. That's the kind of thing where people say, I don't really believe these people. We have a huge problem of trust in this country with our journalism. It's not just to do with race, it's to do with the relationship between power and the people. It's all sorts of things, but that's one of the things. Why is it, do you think, that black people, by and large, don't read the Daily Mail and other papers like that? It's because they don't see themselves, they don't believe that they reflect themselves, notwithstanding the fantastic headline that they once put up about Stephen Lawrence's murderers. But, it's kind of a space which needs to recognise, if you don't recognise the world we live in, you will die. Excuse me, is that a problem for our newspapers at the moment? Is that a problem for the BBC? Is that a problem for ITV? They're losing viewers. Why are they losing people? Strangely, when England do really well in the World Cup, suddenly the viewers come back because they feel good about what they're seeing. One of the great moments for me in all this World Cup fever was seeing Ian Wright in the studio and seeing Ian Wright. Ian Wright was really battling hard for the English team. Ian Wright was saying, we need to be proud of these boys. And Roy Keane, yeah, okay, Roy, you're an Irishman and we know that you don't really, but we are happy today. We got to, that's a great moment, because here's a guy who's standing up for what he believes in, and other people out there are seeing it. It's reflecting the community we live in and reflecting the way many people in our community feel.
Well, you've been talking a lot about recruitment, but I've been wondering whether there isn't something to say as well about the content of newspapers day to day. I mean, are there things that make you angry about that? I mean, for example, you talk about the Daily Mail and about the diverse newsroom. when you look at a paper like that, and not just the Daily Mail, it's just an example, you see a lot of pictures of white people. You don't actually see a lot of pictures of black people in the Daily Mail.
That's because they've got no black photographers, probably, you know, battling out in the, you know, with the picture editor. Oh, I've got a great picture from so-and-so, you know, I should go over here. Why don't you use that? I mean, it's not, we're focusing a lot on the Daily Mail, let's be honest. Daily Telegraph, Daily Express, you know.
And indeed the Guardian.
And the Guardian, all, you know, all these papers have a similar challenge in terms of the way in which they approach reflecting the community that they think they serve. Of course, they've got a particular idea of who they're serving. They're not serving the whole community. You know, it's not like the BBC. The BBC has to serve everyone. The Daily Mail doesn't have to serve everyone. They have to serve the people they want to serve. And that's the way they make their money, because that's the way they get their advertising, and therefore it's the advertising that dictates where they go. So unlike the BBC, which has to serve everyone, they've got a very particular audience. Of course, there's a big question in the future of journalism is how do we monetize the truth? Can we monetize the truth? We, Impress, want the truth. Can we monetize it? Because if you can't monetize it, you can't get the kind of journalism that Impress wants. You can't get the kind of journalism that should make the open world more open, should make democracy more vibrant. Otherwise, it's only particular truths that get purveyed.
One of the issues we have at Impress, though, is complaints about the language that appears in the media, and I wonder if there's any kinds of use of language that make you mad.
Yeah, of course there is. You know, it's about tone, and it's one of the things I think will change actually because of the way in which we now train journalists, young journalists, and the way we increasingly are needing to recruit journalists aged 21, 22, 23 as opposed to 16 or 17. You know, you go back to the 60s and 70s, they were still recruiting a lot of young 16 and 17-year-olds into local papers. They're the ones who became the journalists of the future. We're not doing that anymore. Actually, the baton's almost been passed on from local newspapers to universities, and universities are now training journalists. Wow, that's an opportunity for us to think about those things, the language that's used, how you use it, how you structure a story, who you use, what content you use to inform your story. You know, empiricism, does it matter? Facts, do they matter? We have a chance to train a whole new generation of journalists in a different way, to become critical thinkers, not just to say, you know, that copy needs to be 20 pars, or, you know, 600 words, and that's it. Just make sure you got it there. And you've got to engage your brain, do your critical thinking. Well, we've got the chance to train students, young people, how to do that more effectively, more efficiently, and hopefully produce better journalists. Better journalists, by the way, which in the end will hopefully feed into better journalism, more trustworthy journalism, journalism where people value what they're being told, rather than all this kind of this vacuum we appear to be in, where there's a lack of trust in what we do.
Well, let me give you an example about the language that I'm talking about. There was a story recently when some judges became unpopular with the tabloids, and they did biographies of these members of the Supreme Court and said that one of them was gay. And there was then a little bit of a row about that. So do we agree that you shouldn't gratuitously say people are gay, you shouldn't gratuitously say people are black, you shouldn't gratuitously say people are women, or indeed you shouldn't gratuitously say people are old?
Is it relevant? Or is it just snidey?
Well, how do we decide whether somebody's racial background is relevant or not? I mean,
well, number one, they might make it an issue. They may say it's important to them, or in the context of a story, it's important to them. You know, if you've got a person of colour walks down the street and somebody walks up to them, smacks them in the face and says, "You black bastard, why don't you go back to your country?" Then black's part of the story. You know, if a different context, it might not be part of the story at all. You know, black man goes into the shop and doesn't get served because he left his wallet at home. Well, that's because he hasn't got the money with him. You know, it's a question of the facts of the story. Let the facts tell you what the story's about. Don't just bring this gay or black or woman gratuitous stuff in because you're being a bit snidey about the person, because you're trying to twist the way in which the reader will interpret the story, because you're locking into their prejudices. No, don't do that. You know, think about what you're doing. I mean, some papers like to do that, but woe betide them because people don't trust them when they do it.
Well, for example, when there was publicity about the Rochdale sex abuse cases, a lot of the newspapers, they printed rows of mugshots of all the convicted people. And the reason they did that, and they wouldn't do that in another case, is because you could see that they were all Asian that way. And the subtext of it was these are black rapists, Now,
Well, the truth is, they were people of colour who had groomed young women, and it was wrong. And that was a good example of a very difficult story to tell. The tone often wasn't quite right, but it was because I think newsrooms were wrestling with that. It wasn't like 30 years ago where they wouldn't even wrestle with it. They would have just said, look at these people coming over here and raping our daughters. No, people recognise that is wrong. That would have been the wrong tone. But the problem is a problem, and you can't get away from it. There were grooming gangs who were grooming young girls for abuse, and it needed to be tackled. And you need to look behind it and understand and work out why it was happening. Not just in Rotherham, by the way, in other parts of the country too. Is this something we need to ascribe to a particular cultural approach to the way in which, that negotiating difference? Remember, we started that conversation with negotiating difference. Are we negotiating that difference effectively in the way we're telling this story? Sometimes they got it right, sometimes they got it wrong, but the basic story was right, that actually this was something very bad that had happened or was happening in our community, and we should get on top of it. In the same way as Jimmy Savile was not a very nice man, and for many, many years we all laughed at him, thinking he was a very nice man, even though there were people who knew he wasn't a very nice man. And then, shock horror, Rolf Harris, Jimmy Savile turn out to be not so pleasant people.
So you're saying we shouldn't sweep under the carpet in our journalism racial issues. We should openly grapple with them.
Yeah, because they're not necessarily racial. I come back to that
Well,
point of
potentially
race.
racial.
Well, it's about our differences, yeah? And we've got to recognise there
Racial
are
or
differences.
cultural.
Cultural differences, absolutely. Because there are cultural differences. Why are we trying to sweep them under the carpet? That's why we as journalists are trying to sweep them under the carpet. Goodness sake, in the 1930s, they tried to sweep one big cultural issue under the carpet, and look what happened. We ended up in a big mess in Europe. As a consequence of that, we needed to confront that. We need to remind ourselves that actually, when we sweep these things under the carpet, we do ourselves, our society, a great disservice, because we're just building up, on the one hand, a whole heap of problems for ourselves, or we're enabling those who will do things in our name to do them in a way which we suddenly turn around, well, we didn't want them to do that. 6 million Jews were murdered because it was effectively swept under the carpet, and people, the propaganda at the time, the news media at the time, pushed it under the carpet. They allowed people to get away with things that should not have been got away with, should have been called out. We don't want to be back there. We need to understand that actually pluralistic journalism defends us from the enemies of an open society, and we need to make sure it's robust and open, and we're not sweeping things under the carpet.
Okay, so just to sum up that, what's the one thing we could do that would improve the situation? What I've taken from you is that you're saying there's no trust in journalism from the black community, to simplify what you're saying.
Well,
what's the one thing that could restore the trust? I mean, if you had to prioritize.
Listen, we've talked about a world which is complex. In a complex world, I'm sorry to say this, Dave, but there's no one thing, okay? There's a whole raft of things that are going to have to be done. But there are things that can be done, like getting more people into the newsroom. That's easy. It's an easy win.
Okay, so number one, getting more people into the
Correct.
newsroom. Right.
Making sure that the kind of stories that we're seeking out reflect the community that we serve. In other words, getting people out into places where they don't normally go. How many stories do you see on housing estates? You don't see them, do you? Look at Grenfell. Grenfell tells us that there's a whole community out there we've forgotten about. Suddenly, there's a big tower fire, 72 people die, and people say, how did that happen? Well, excuse me, we knew it could happen, but we just forgot to talk about it. We need to, some places are better than others at doing that, but we need to recognise there's a big world out there, and it's our job to reflect that big world. That will help people have more faith in what we're doing. We as journalists are supposed to speak truth under power, are we not? Therefore, that should be our mission. But truth under power means all sorts of different truths that need to be spoken to them. And we need a broader range of people to help us explore that. And if we don't have that broader range of people, journalism will suffer, newspapers will die, broadcasters will die, and people now, because of that digital space, will go somewhere else. Guess what happens when that happens? We no longer have the means to build community through what we do. We just have greater fragmentation. We don't want to go there.
Thank you very much, Kurt Barling. And thank you for joining this one of the Impress webinar series.